The clinking of champagne glasses was a shrill counterpoint to the booming laughter echoing through the garden. Garden parties. My personal version of hell. Especially when they were celebrating her engagement. Clarissa, my cousin, the golden child, the epitome of everything I wasn't and, according to my parents, should aspire to be. I swirled the cheap bubbly in my glass, the bubbles as flat as my mood. I was surrounded by relatives, each one a walking, talking reminder of my inadequacies. Aunt Mildred, who always commented on my weight with a thinly veiled concern that dripped with condescension. Uncle George, who never failed to remind me about my lack of ambition. And of course my parents, the ringleaders of this particular circus of misery, still seeing that. What was his name? Oh, right, nothing, my mother chirped, her voice carrying just a little too far. She was beaming at Mrs. Abernathy, whose daughter had just landed a doctor. The smugness was palpable. My father chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that always felt like an earthquake rumbling through my insides. Oh, Martha, you know how Eleanor gets. Always with her head in the clouds. This fiancé of hers is probably a figment of her imagination. A coping mechanism, wouldn't you say? The Abernathysts joined in the laughter. It wasn't malicious, not exactly, but it was laced with that distinct brand of pity that stung worse than outright insults. I felt my face flush. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the perfectly manicured lawn. But I stood my ground, clutching my glass like a lifeline. 4 years, I'd endured their endless barbs about my single status, my career choices, or lack thereof, according to them, my overall, unremarkable existence. But this was a new level of humiliation. They were mocking the one thing I had finally allowed myself to be proud of, the one thing that made me feel like I was actually winning at life. I cleared my throat, the sound barely audible above the merriment. Actually, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, he's very real, and very busy. He sends his apologies for being late. Something about parking the helicopter. The laughter died down, replaced by a stunned silence. My mother's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. My father's face tightened. Clarissa, radiant in her ivory dress, looked vaguely amused. Helicopter. Aunt Mildred finally squeaked. Yes, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. He flew in from Dubai. We just landed, actually. He had a rather important business meeting this morning. You know, billion-dollar deals and all that. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, a ripple of nervous murmuring spread through the crowd. Billion-dollar deals? Dubai? Helicopter? This wasn't the Eleanor they knew, the Eleanor they dismissed as a hopeless romantic with a penchant for impractical dreams. I took a sip of my champagne, savoring the moment. It was time to rewrite the narrative, to paint a picture so outrageous, so unbelievable, that they wouldn't know what to think. And I had just the man to help me do it. Just then, a shadow fell across the patio. A hush descended as a man strode into the garden, radiating an almost absurd level of confidence. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, and possessed a smile that could melt glaciers. He looked like he'd stepped out of a James Bond movie. "Sorry I'm late," he boomed, his voice a rich baritone that commanded attention. "Had to park the helicopter. Security was a nightmare." He winked at me, then extended a hand to my father. "Alexander Sterling, pleasure to finally meet you, sir. Eleanor speaks very highly of you. Alexander Sterling, my imaginary fiancé. Or, more accurately, my very real and very expensive friend who owed me a rather large favor." The look on my parents' faces was priceless. My father, usually so quick with a sarcastic remark, was speechless, his mouth gaping open like a landed fish. My mother's eyes darted from Alexander to me, and back again, a mixture of disbelief and dawning. Something. Was that respect? Alexander launched into a charming anecdote about his brief visit to Dubai, casually dropping names of sheiks and CEOs like confetti. He talked about his company, Sterling Enterprises, a global conglomerate that I knew existed only in his meticulously crafted LinkedIn profile. He even managed to work in a mention of his private jet and his charity work in Africa. The family was mesmerized. Even Clarissa, whose engagement party this was supposed to be, was hanging on his every word. I watched, a quiet satisfaction bubbling inside me. The tables had turned. I was no longer the object of pity, but of envy, and it felt glorious. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of faux affection and exaggerated interest. My parents fawned over Alexander, showering him with the kind of attention they usually reserved for Clarissa. Aunt Mildred miraculously forgot about my weight and asked me about my exciting life in Dubai. Uncle George quizzed Alexander about investment opportunities. It was excruciating and hilarious all at once. Alexander, bless his heart, played his role to perfection. He was charming, witty, and endlessly fascinating. He danced with me, his hand warm on my back, whispering jokes in my ear. He even managed to convince my father to try a complicated handshake he'd apparently learned from a Tibetan monk. The whole thing was utterly absurd, a carefully orchestrated charade designed to shatter the image they had of me. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Alexander announced that we had to leave. "Early flight back to Dubai," he explained, his arm possessively around my waist. "Important meeting with the Prime Minister of wherever Stan. You understand." My parents practically begged us to stay, but Alexander remained firm. He exchanged a few more pleasantries, shook hands all around, and then led me toward the helicopter, which was actually a black SUV that I'd prearranged with a particularly theatrical driver. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the garden. My family was still standing there, their faces a mixture of awe and bewilderment. I could practically hear the whispers, "Billionaire, Dubai, helicopter." I turned to Alexander, who was already chuckling. "Well, that was something," he said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I haven't felt that much pressure since I tried to convince my ex-girlfriend that I was a professional dog walker." I laughed, a genuine heartfelt laugh that I hadn't felt in a long time. "You were amazing," I said. "Thank you. I owe you big time." "Don't mention it," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Consider it payback for all those times you helped me edit my online dating profile. Besides, it was fun to play the role of the ridiculously wealthy cliché for a few hours. Though, I did almost choke when your Aunt Mildred asked me if I owned a yacht." "A yacht? Eleanor. Where would I even park it?" We spent the rest of the evening recounting the most ridiculous moments of the afternoon, laughing until our sides ached. It was a cathartic release, a way to process the years of pent-up resentment and frustration. But as the laughter subsided, a more serious thought crept into my mind. What now? I had successfully pulled off the ultimate revenge fantasy, but what had I actually accomplished? Had I really changed their perception of me? Or had I simply reinforced their preconceived notions about success and happiness? I knew my parents. They wouldn't suddenly transform into enlightened beings who valued me for who I was, not what I did or who I was with. They would simply transfer their obsession from Clarissa to me, demanding details about my glamorous life in Dubai, pressuring me to settle down with Alexander, or someone equally impressive, and generally making my life a living hell in a different, but equally annoying, way. I sighed. The truth was, I didn't need their validation. I didn't need a billionaire fiancé, a private jet, or a life of luxury to be happy. I just needed to be myself, to pursue my own passions, to live a life that was authentic and meaningful to me. And so, I decided to take a different approach. The next day, I called my parents. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Thank you for the engagement party. It was interesting." There was a pause, a pregnant silence that crackled with anticipation. I could practically feel them holding their breath, waiting for me to launch into a bragfest about my amazing fiancé. "I wanted to let you know that Alexander and I have decided to take a break," I continued. "It turns out that our lifestyles are not as compatible as we initially thought." Another pause. I could hear my mother sputtering in the background. "A break?" my father finally managed to stammer. But the helicopter, the Dubai, the billions." I smiled to myself. "Yes, well," I said, "it seems that money can't buy happiness." And frankly, I was tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. I told them that I was going to focus on my own life, on my own goals. I told them that I was happy, even without the extravagant trappings of wealth and success. And then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I told them that I loved them, not for who they wanted me to be, but for who they were. The conversation ended on a somewhat ambiguous note. I knew they didn't fully understand, but I also sensed a flicker of something else, something akin to acceptance. Over the next few months, I made a conscious effort to reconnect with my parents on a deeper level. I stopped trying to impress them, stopped trying to live up to their expectations. I simply shared my life with them, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the failures. I told them about my writing, the novel I was working on, the struggles and the joys of the creative process. I told them about my volunteer work at the local animal shelter, the satisfaction of helping abandoned animals find loving homes. I even told them about my disastrous attempts at online dating, the awkward encounters and the hilarious miscommunications. Slowly, gradually, their perception of me began to shift. They started to see me, not as a disappointment, but as a complex, multifaceted individual with her own unique strengths and passions. They started to appreciate me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. It wasn't a miraculous transformation, of course. There were still moments of misunderstanding, moments of judgment, moments when I wanted to scream and run away. But there were also moments of genuine connection, moments of unconditional love, moments when I realized that, despite everything, we were still a family. And that, I realized, was the real revenge. Not the superficial triumph of outdoing Clarissa or impressing my relatives, but the profound and lasting satisfaction of being true to myself, of forging my own path, of building a life that was authentic and meaningful, regardless of what anyone else thought. As for Alexander, he remains a dear friend, a co-conspirator in my ongoing efforts to subvert societal expectations and defy conventional notions of success. And every now and then, when I need a good laugh, we still reminisce about that fateful engagement party and the day I parked the helicopter.